kaila. Ezili fantija mora kaila. Ma perela se upote wangani bo. Ma perela se upote wangani bo. Ezili fantija mora kaila me vela tupai.
One of the biggest misconceptions is that voodoo is evil, that we worship the devil. There's no devil or evil in voodoo. Voodoo just is. There's no black and white magic in voodoo either.
Ma perela se upote wangani bo. Ezili fantija mora kaila me vela tupai.
The belief that voodoo is evil and voodoo is dark comes from the fact that voodoo is black. My family and I, we are from the Dominican Republic. Voodoo, it was just always part of my family. That's the thing with voodoo. If it's in your family and it hasn't been so far removed through generations, it'll still show up in some shape or form. Voodoo comes from West Africa. My lineage of voodoo is Haitian voodoo. It's a voodoo that was brought from Africa to the island of Haiti, and it became its own thing. Voodoo is family, voodoo is roots, voodoo is food, it's music, voodoo is prayer, it's song, dance, voodoo is worship, it's nature, it's knowing that everything around you is connected to you. In voodoo, we call the priestess a mambo and the priest a wongan. So a voodoo priestess is chosen by her family to take on that prestigious role. I didn't have any plans to turn my spiritual practice into a business. It was such a private thing for me. My husband and I do spiritual consultations, and the spiritual consultations are very different than any kind of reading, divination that you've ever done, because you're directly speaking to a spirit. The spirit comes, the spirit gets on the steering wheel, and we are on the passenger seat, and they're the ones just spilling all the beans. You came here asking for a man, asking about a man, when your actual problem is this, and this is what you need to be focused on. But what about the man? F the man. This is your problem. You need to fix this, or else nothing matters. Oh, and I get messages from clients just saying thank you for the work. It doesn't matter whether it was, I haven't been able to get a job in 2 years and your job candle got me a job, or I've been working on this project for so long and I haven't been able to get it off the ground and your success candle helped me with that. Every day I'm fulfilled and rewarded whenever I hear that someone benefited from my work. A lot of times when I tell people that I'm a mambo, they're like, oh wow, really? What is that like? It's hard to put it into simple words. Or usually people are like, is that like being a witch? No. Voodoo is not witchcraft because voodoo is voodoo. Voodoo is African, voodoo is ancestral. And for witchcraft, especially nowadays, ancestors is not something that's necessary. Hoodoo's ancestor is voodoo. The Africans that were brought to the US through the South, who were enslaved, they took from voodoo what they could, and then they mixed with what was already here, which is Native American traditions and a little bit of European traditions, and that's what Hoodoo became. The biggest misconceptions of voodoo is that voodoo is evil, that we worship the devil. There's no devil in voodoo. We don't know that guy. We know that guy does not exist in our court of spirits. No, voodoo is just like everything else when it comes to spirituality. You have your light and you have your dark. The devil and demons don't come from Black culture. They come from European culture. So it's quite the opposite. It's important for me to continue spreading light and truth about voodoo, hoodoo in anything that has to do with African traditions. Anything that comes from, I call it the grandmotherland because my motherland is Haiti. It's important to me that people are educated, and I'm taking a big responsibility being so vocal about it, but I don't want to be the only one. And I do want people who are strong in these traditions to feel comfortable enough to step forward and educate and work on removing the misconceptions and removing the misinformation and removing the taboos and the ugly that has been attached to anything Black for so many generations.
Throughout chattel slavery, there were Black people in and outside of the community believed to have the power. The power was known by different things in various regions and times. In the 17th century, it was cunning men, conjurers, and witches. By the 19th century, you were more likely to hear hoodoo, emerging in print as early as 1870, and root workers. Some people performed tricking, aka casting spells. People who trafficked in misfortune with their powers were trick doctors and witch doctors. If you hailed from Florida, South Carolina, or Georgia, you'd hear conjure doctors, wise men, two-head doctors, long heads, and double-sighters. Perfect names for healers. Among the Black populations in Louisiana and Mississippi, you'd hear about voodoos, wangateurs, and horses. No matter what word was used, the people who were believed to be available for injuring or destroying enemies, getting rid of rivals or undesirables, softening hearts, winning or holding love, breaking up homes, calling the absent, getting jobs, dodging the law, protecting property, detecting criminals, gambling, collecting debts, disciplining servants, stopping trains and steamboats, producing fertility or barrenness in women, promoting crops, controlling weather, foretelling the future, and locating lost and stolen goods, water, and buried treasure. Oh my God, that's a lot of responsibility. By the way, that quote was from the really excellent Black Magic, Religion, and the African American Conjuring Tradition by Yvonne P. Chirot. Even more folklore told of witches who could fly, shapeshift, or become invisible. There were stories about boo hags or skinless shapeshifting witches that slipped through keyholes and windows. Unlike European witch lore, these witches didn't fly on broomsticks. They rode human beings like horses, draining their energy and sucking on their breath, but ultimately keeping them alive, unless they struggled. If you struggled, your skin might get stolen. Some folklore says the boo hags were the ghosts of conjurers. People were advised to keep Bibles around and sprinkle salt and pepper into corners of the room or on the skin of the hag, so that when it came to wear it, it'd be too uncomfortable to wear. I can't help but to mention that boo hags sound like a cool way to explain sleep paralysis before people understood what it was, and that various cultures have their version of sleep demons. Also, stories about shape-shifting witches and other creatures were excellent tales to tell small children, white or Black, in Black women's care to get them to behave. Like most folklore and beliefs, the ones of the enslaved served a purpose. Stories of root and conjure workers getting even with enslavers or exacting revenge were crucial parts of Black American folklore and resistance. The ultimate power of those who dabbled in conjure, magic, and voodoo was the sense of control they had during a time when Black people were stripped of personhood and autonomy. Stories about strong practitioners could serve as pride and inspiration for dehumanized people. Magic and superstition are often utilized as a belief system to rationalize misfortune, similar to religion, and it's no wonder that all three concepts would flourish during the 400 years of chattel slavery, and even blend together and mingle with European beliefs about witchcraft. But whereas in the European tradition, witches were mostly associated with the devil and heresy, Black people saw magic more ambiguously. Argued Yvonne P. Chirot, witches were often presented as being inherently harmful and wicked, where conjurers were more likely to have chosen revenge or to harm, with the capacity for good. Another one of her central points is that Black people practiced conjure often along with Christianity, when one failed to meet needs that the other couldn't supply. Black pastors were noted to dabble in conjure to aid their flocks, and would be the majority of the reported conjurers in the 18th and 19th century. White observers were appalled, with one folklorist calling their practices a horrible debasement of some of the highest and noblest doctrines of the Christian faith. Women, meanwhile, who were rearing and helping deliver children, seeing to injuries, and providing emotional labor, used a plethora of items, tricks, and rituals to provide care to those around them, barter for goods or services, or make a little money on the side. In New England, a woman named Chloe Russell made bank divining the future. She was born in 1745, allegedly near Sierra Leone, enslaved and sold to a man in Virginia. After After using her powers to help him find $60,000 his dead uncle had hidden, he bought her freedom and paid her $500. She then used the money to start a fortune-telling business and buy a house, making her one of 6 black women in Boston to own property. She used her profits to buy freedom for other enslaved people, according to a hotly debated biography in her 1827 dream book. Dream books had been around for centuries, giving interpretations of nighttime visions and guidance, but in the 19th century, they were books by white people featuring racist depictions on the cover, like Old Aunt Dinah. However, a real Chloe Russell did live in Boston at the time and own property, so I'm leaning on her publishing the book herself, or at least having a part in it. We'll be back to divining and fortune-telling later. The white planter Charles Colcock Jr. alleged that conjure women predominated in black communities in the coastal regions of Georgia and the Carolinas. It's no coincidence that this is where Gullah Geechee people lived. Because of a certain level of insular autonomy, the Gullah had more traditions directly from Africa. Cures like the life everlasting plant were given with magic utterances to add supernatural power, and also placed around the home to ward off spirits and harm, and they erected bottle trees to capture malevolent spirits. But everywhere, the enslaved heard or knew of people who were described to be born with the gift, or in Frederick Douglass's description of Sandy Jenkins as a genuine African, and had inherited some of the so-called magical powers said to be possessed by the Eastern nations. Sandy gave him a special root to carry in his pocket while fighting his white master, and won. Staple ingredients for conjure workers included rabbit's feet, the bones of a black cat, red pepper, hair, nails, skin, bodily secretions, and roots like High John the Conqueror, which was often utilized in pouches known as mojo bags, gree-gree, lucky hands, and more. They were worn secretly on one's person for protection and also served to create fortune in life, love, gambling, or money. Conjurers employed various practices and fetishes with roots in Africa. Fetishes were items at the center of spiritual life, like divining objects, talismans, charms, or vessels believed to be holding spirits, like gree-gree. Gree-gree, from the Mende language meaning spiritual force. Back in pre-colonial Africa, people treated their charms with care and even provided offerings. In America, conjurers included Bible verses on their charms or fed them with a little whiskey or corn liquor. And various WPA narratives discussing folklore beliefs of formerly enslaved people describe pouring out a little liquor for spirits to keep them at bay. This practice, called libation, has existed since ancient Egypt and has been common throughout the world. Years later, describing an incident in the early 1930s, Mrs. Emmeline Hurd of Georgia told a story in which a man's sweetheart died in a buggy accident next to him and began haunting him when he took his next sweetheart near where she died. Do you know that horse stopped right in front of that house and wouldn't budge 1 inch? No matter how hard he whipped that horse, it wouldn't move. Instead, he almost turned the buggy over. She said that he was then advised by an old slavery time man to pour a quart of whiskey around the buggy to make the haunt leave, which worked. One Patsy Moses of Fort Bend, Texas, said she learned tricking from her enslaved father and mother, like how to make a good charm bag. Many of these kinds of items were found at excavated plantation sites. It makes sense that immediately after arriving into America, healers and conjurers who were pinnacles of their tribes and villages found similar ingredients or practices to take care of themselves and others. So conjurers were doctors, life coaches, and even could serve as an enforcer. Those with the power of divining were called on to find thieves or a betrayer in the community for justice or retribution, which meant certain people were gifted with power over the reputations of others. And this is where it gets sticky. People often sought healing from conjure doctors because they believed that someone hating had put the roots on them. Roots made for good excuses, especially when an enslaved person had a pleasant view of their white enslaver. This is despite the poor conditions of slavery that bred a higher infant mortality rate, malnutrition, high blood pressure, unsafe conditions, overwork, and everything in between. Sickness and injury became so intertwined with alleged roots and negative energy that a former enslaved man and pastor, Irving E. Lowry, remarked that the slaves very often connected sickness and death with voodooism or conjuration. Early 20th century white supremacist and historian Murda Lockett Avery wrote, "Negroes are not necessarily loyal as a race. They fear each other, dread covert acts of vengeance, and being conjured." Does this sound familiar? Just a little bit? While enslaved narratives offer conflicting views about the reality of conjuring beliefs were more common than not, and paranoia abounded. Lots of WPA narratives feature people saying someone jealous or angry about their success caused them to become sick or fall on hard times, which is frighteningly similar to modern statements about having haters plotting on your downfall. During and after enslavement, black people's inadequate health care, infant mortality, loss of employment or housing, and other systemic issues were blamed on conjure or roots, rather than white supremacy and the extremely unforgivable sin of not providing reparations. One woman was accused of fixing her neighbor and was said to have been envious of another woman who had provided nice clothes and dancing lessons for her child, highlighting classism and inadequate resources. Another woman believed she had been conjured because her straight hair was desired by most females, highlighting featureism and internalized misogyny. The power that conjurers wielded, both perceived and via influence, was also dangerous to white enslavers. Conjurers played key roles in multiple enslaved rebellions, from the revolution in Haiti to Peter the Doctor of the 1712 New York City enslaved rebellion, who rubbed magic powder on rebels. As much of their food and drink were prepared by the people they callously dehumanized and bought and sold, whites were always terrified of poisonings, which were frequently linked to black conjuring, provoking South Carolina to create a law in 1751 that banned the enslaved from teaching others about the knowledge of any poisonous root, plant herb, or other poison, with the punishment being death. But what about Louisiana and voodoo, which inspired the word hoodoo but is not the same thing? Back in Africa, voodoo was the religion of tribes living in present-day Benin, or Dahomey of West Africa. It was also practiced amongst people in modern-day Togo, Ghana, and Nigeria. They took their beliefs, particularly worship of the ancestors, with them to Haiti and the Caribbean when sold into slavery, creating the Afro culture and religion voodoo, which incorporated the Orisha, or spirit sent by the Supreme Creator. The religion grew in the absence of white colonizers after the Haitian Revolution ended in 1804. In Spanish and French New Orleans, meanwhile, West Africans had been developing their own culture since 1719, known as voodoo, which I know is confusing, but it was different. And they did this with way less connections to African divinities because of the presence of whites. In 1809, approximately 10,000 Haitians arrived to New Orleans and changed the city's demographics, and their voodoo fused with voodoo to become voodoo, aka the Afro-Creole counterculture in southern Louisiana, and a common term for African diaspora beliefs of magical practices. Because voodoo ceremonies had empowered Haiti's enslaved population to fight back, it became synonymous with enslavers' worst fears about slave superstitions and possible violent conspiracies. In 1817, the city of New Orleans authorized Congo Square, which contained the city's enslaved population on their Sundays off. This was for surveillance, making sure the voodoo practitioners, who were often there surrounded by dancing, eating, and drinking, weren't going to harm the city, the slave trade, or the elite. One of the most famed practitioners of all time, Marie Laveau, was known to work her skills at Congo Square. Well, she and her daughter, the second Marie Laveau. Marie I earned a reputation of being able to harm people and protect people from harm with her rituals, specializing in romance and business quarrels. As a hairdresser, gossip and client coaxing made her able to appear all-knowing, and ultimately a very powerful harborer of secrets for the New Orleans elite. Whites and blacks alike would go to her for business. Judges wanting to win elections, a woman wanting to discredit another woman for the attention of a man, she did it all. However, she usually charged whites and helped black people for free. Her daughter, Marie II, followed in her mother's footsteps by becoming a voodoo priestess. Whereas Marie I was usually kind and only vindictive when the situation called for it, Marie II allegedly relied on the fear of her subjects to remain in control, though she reportedly provided aid during the yellow fever epidemic of 1878. She would prove to be adept at voodoo spectacles, however. Even though Marie I died on June 16, 1881 at the alleged age of 98, sightings of the voodoo priestess would continue to be seen for years to come. Some of these can be attributed to Marie II, who didn't die until the 1890s. However, sightings of Marie Laveau continued until as late as 1918. Urban legend says that drawing an X on Laveau's tomb and leaving an offering of money, candy, or white rum 3 times will earn you a free wish from her. By the way, Laveau never sat for a painter or had her picture taken, and this portrait regularly used for her is not actually her. Throughout the late 19th century, voodoo was sensationalized. Nationwide after enslavement, when Reconstruction was a hotly debated political issue, newspapers began describing hoodoo and voodoo in frightening terms. Said one in 1873, "Voodooism is simply the worship of the devil." In Louisiana, accounts of white journalists experiencing wild orgies and voodoo at St. John's Eve ceremonies around the bayous of Lake Pontchartrain began in 1869. While voodoo practitioners were making a killing from the white thrill seekers who watched the dancing, drank alcohol, bought coffee and gumbo, and sometimes sex, stories about what went down were partly fabricated and featured covered things from interracial orgies to cannibalism. Male voodoo practitioners were also linked to rape in the white media from the 1870s to 1880s. Wrote one New Orleans news editor in a story about voodoo, "The Negroes of Haiti have had the absolute government of themselves for 3/4 of a century, and every desirable element of civilization almost has been wiped out in the decadence of the island under Negro rule." Failing to mention Haiti's massive debt to France and international embargo and sanctions. Expounded another, documented by Michelle Y. Gordon, voodoo was proof that without the influence of slavery, Haitians fall back upon the superstitions and habits of their ancestors. Black newspapers warned that white ones were intentionally distorting stories about voodoo to foster mistrust and disgust of black people. As Reconstruction ended, black voter registration plummeted, and white supremacist Democrats consolidated by the end of the century. And those wild voodoo ceremony news stories faded, and were only brought up as proof of Reconstruction's failings. In the years to come, voodoo, the religion and culture, would come to be erroneously conflated with hoodoo. When Northerners came down to the South between 1861 and 1875, teachers, clergy, cultural reformers, many were more keen to offer religiosity than material aid. While judging black Americans as inferior beings who could be polished up with education and opportunity but still be second-class citizens, they also considered conjure to be evil, implying that they believed it to be real and superstition as proof of inferiority. They claimed the black pastors, who wielded massive amounts of power, were too lenient about supernatural stuff and incorporating conjure into their congregations. There were black people saying this too, believing that belief in root work and the supernatural ruined the odds of racial progress. So conversations about black witchcraft were wrapped up in respectability politics. Said Octavia Rogers Albert, "Yes, the vice of voodooism which is practiced among the colored people is the result of ignorance and slavery. They will, in the course of time, ignore such doctrine, for they are being educated, and the time will come when such simple and nonsensical teachings will find no place among them." Hampton Institute's Samuel Chapman Armstrong began studying superstition and folk belief among black people in 1878, in the process calling out students at Hampton who admitted to believing in conjure. In 1893, the students and teachers created the first Black Folklore Society to document and study black beliefs, though it only lasted until 1899. The rise of black American Christianity outside the bonds of slavery, when paired with respectability politics, only made conjure and superstitions, and by association any remnants of African religions and divinities, seem not only like an impediment to the progression of the race, but evil. Years down the line, it's why so many black people in the modern day weren't allowed to watch or read media with witchcraft, but could watch all the hood classics. Like, I remember going to a girl's house when I was younger, and we were allowed to watch Friday, but not allowed to watch Harry Potter. And it also trickled down to why people who pay homage to our ancestors or who are interested in African conjure traditions are called demon worshippers. So clearly the belief in conjure and people with the power would remain, creating divergent groups of those who dabbled in it, downright feared it and called it evil, or simply ignored it. Meanwhile, African American conjuring and superstition would become frequent literary devices in black literature, like The Conjure Woman, an 1899 collection of short stories by Charles Chestnut, an author and pillar of the black Cleveland community who could pass as a white man but chose not to. His stories were inspired by tales about conjure women in North Carolina. In one, a woman named Aunt Peggy the Conjure Woman curses the soup of a cruel enslaver named Mars Jeems and turns him into his worst nightmare, a black man. He's forced to be a slave and then turned back, which ultimately changes his behavior. So fast forward to the beginning of the era of the Great Migration, when a flow of 6 million black people began leaving the South to go north and west, taking their traditions and stories with them. Conjure and hoodoo will become a popular topic in the emerging blues genre too. Sang Ma Rainey and Black Dust Blues, "It was way last year when my trouble began. I had done quarreled with a woman. She said I took her man. She sent me a letter, said she's gonna turn me round. She's gonna fix me up so I won't chase her man around. I began to feel bad, worse than I ever before. Lord, I was out one morning, found black dust all around my floor." Speaking of blues, in Memphis, the city gained a reputation for its hoodoo practitioners and product manufacturers. Robert Church, the first black multimillionaire, bought land on Beale Street for a park, auditorium, recreational center, and hotel. It is along this corridor of Beale that black Memphis culture, food, music, and even hoodoo blossomed. Along Beale Street, you could purchase black cat bones and mojo bags from secret back rooms. Lily Mae Glover, who was known as Ma Rainey too, was known for her mojo bags, filling them with sugar, flour, and a heap of coal. Gold miners would ask Beale Street practitioners to give them guidance to find fortune in the Mississippi River. Over time, the thriving industry was targeted because the growing presence of spiritual doctors and conjurers would be perceived as a threat to outsiders, who viewed the culture as a haven for deviants and criminals. There would be freaked out news editorials and raids on conjurers and frequent arrests. And to learn more about Memphis's special history with hoodoo, check out this book by Tony Kail. Down in New Orleans, the Cracker Jack drugstore was one of many that sold all kinds of magical items. Though the Cracker Jack thrived in the Black South Rampart Street neighborhood from the late 1800s to the 1970s, and even offered a root guide to curing yourself of syphilis and gonorrhea. It was owned by a white man, however, but that was the new world of hoodoo. By the 1920s, customers could buy charms, candles, powders, and roots from catalogs and white stores who were appropriating hoodoo cures and culture. The aforementioned mojo bag was stripped of its cultural context, and the word mojo, which descends from the Fulani word makoko for medicine man, became a slang term for sexual virility after its use in blues and jazz. The John the Conqueror root, whose name came from a black folk hero, became commercial products with white men on them. These practices were everywhere, especially after the Great Migration. Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender frequently published ads by conjure workers, fortune tellers, spiritual advisors, mediums, prophets, and healers, many preying on newcomers who wanted jobs, love, good fortune, or even luck in the thriving numbers racket that would emerge in the 1920s. In Harlem alone, by 1925, there were 30 black banks doing numbers bets, and plenty of conjurers advertised their charm services. Clairvoyants sold lucky numbers for anywhere from 10 to 25 cents, and gamblers could even get spiritual guidance for $1 to $3 a session. Like other cities, Harlem was filled with hustlers, and it was hard to tell them apart from the righteous, which is why a new magic industry flourished, one that was completely different from the conjuring of enslavement. In LaShawn Harris's excellent book, Sex Workers, Sidekicks, and Number Runners, there were religious and mystical black women who mixed hoodoo and Pentecostalism, like Reverend Josephine Betcon and Rosa Artemis Horn, who I can't find pictures of with their mysterious asses. Horn was a radio evangelist who claimed to make the blind see and heal the sick and lonely, perfect for people who feared the racist medical field and white doctors. Conjure doctors claimed to reportedly heal everything, including serious disease and ailments like tuberculosis. Black women turned their homes or small retail spaces into temples and seance gatherings, where they could make money through honest belief in their powers or by scamming. The writer and poet Claude McKay attended one, noting that the priestess, whose walls included words like love and live, was tipped $5 each by attendees and encouraged to give more for good spirits. These women sold incenses, candles, body crystals, dried leaves, figs, flowers, and jars of lotions, powders, oils, and spray, with labels offering strong love, domination, peaceful home, money jackpot, get away, evil, court case, and death onto my enemy. Chow, not death. Damn. Reverend V.D.S. Armistead, founder of the First Holy Star Psychic Science Church, which totally sounds made up because it is, sold prosperity oil for 10 cents to $1 a bottle. And I don't have a picture of her either, so you gotta imagine what she looked like. Some, like Dorothy Madame Fou Fatam Matthews, a Jamaican-born Chinese and black woman who owned a candle shop, sold dream books. She evoked the mammy stereotype on the book's cover, harkening back to old Aunt Dinah. On January 19, 1938, the numbers queen of Harlem, Stephanie St. Clair, shot her husband Sufi Abdul Hamid. He was a prominent black anti-Semite, cult leader, and pro-black capitalist. She alleged he cheated on her with a conjure woman from Jamaica. That woman was Madame Fou Fatam, who married Hamid 3 months later. He mysteriously died in a plane crash just 4 months after that in August, leaving Fatam with all of his money. They had opened the Universal Holy Temple of Tranquility and utilized Asian mysticism and Buddhism, but under Fatam, who claimed Hamid would come back from the dead in 60 days, the cult ended. As Harris pointed out, this was part of a larger trend of black supernatural consultants adopting Asian motifs to appear exotic and more powerful, and also for respect from white people. Because New York was full of immigrants, others utilized their Caribbean roots to incorporate elements of voodoo, even if they had no power or idea what they were doing. But not everybody was putting on an act. In 1931's Hoodoo in America, Zora Neale Hurston, who studied voodoo in the Caribbean and was one of the few prominent academics defending magic, wrote one becomes a hoodoo doctor in one of three ways: by heredity, by serving an apprenticeship under an established practitioner, or by the call. The most influential doctors seemed to be born to the cult, but the money called to the fakers. The New York Amsterdam News reported on a bunch of scam artists, but many were experts at convincing their marks that they just hadn't done the right spell work or applied their oil correctly. By the time Madame Fou Fatam was taking over as the leader of the soon-to-be closed temple in her husband's estate, New York was seeking to crack down on the magic industry, which was crucial to Harlem's informal economy in the midst of the Great Depression. People were desperate. In 1937, CBS produced a film on Harlem alleging that nearly 1/3 of Harlem's Negroes have become voodoo worshippers. It claimed that voodoo racketeers weren't deterred by those seeking to root them out. Harlem mystics adopt a new strategy: masquerade as Christian clergymen, and the backrooms in Harlem continues in all its primitive savagery and superstition, the witchcraft of the African Congo.
Harlem's 300,000 Negroes are deeply religious, with an incredible assortment of creeds and denominations. In addition to their religious beliefs, Harlem's people have a childlike faith in spirits and spiritualism. Depression years stimulated Harlem's interest in the occult. Hundreds sought the advice of mystics in the hope of picking winning numbers in the widespread policy racket. Others, seeking to improve their fortune, go to secret meetings in dingy Harlem flats. Join a cult whose roots go back to darkest Africa. Exotic, barbaric, the cult of voodoo.
So in addition to falsely reporting on what voodoo actually is, that documentary pissed off black New Yorkers like clergy leaders and the NAACP. Adam Clayton Powell Sr. denounced supernatural believers and practitioners, and cops increasingly began charging conjurers with illegally practicing medicine without a license. The Food, Drugs, and Cosmetics Act of 1938 led to more arrests. Fortune-telling could earn a person a disorderly conduct charge, and by the mid-1930s, by the way, at least 19 American cities had laws prohibiting fortune-telling, which became a misdemeanor in New York, subject to a $500 fine or 90 days in jail in 1967. When talking to my family members about this video topic, I asked them about their experiences with root workers growing up. Both of my grandparents, reared as Christians in the most rural parts of North and South Carolina in the 1950s, heard about people who were rumored to dabble in conjuring, from side chicks putting roots on wives to women whispering about menstrual blood and spaghetti sauce, to knowing people who took trips to fortune tellers. In rural areas, hoodoo and conjure tradition would definitely remain. Overall, however, women in these professions existed in some shape or form in the later half of the century, but less prominently so. Superstition, while still around in various ways, mostly became overshadowed by literacy, education, religion, and mainstream culture. As society became slightly more equitable and more black Americans gained access to the American dream, the need for a belief in a system that granted a sense of control in a chaotic and cruel world diminished. That's not to say that black hoodoo practitioners and occult dabblers didn't remain, but that there were fewer believers, though more would come around during tough times. Said Ebony magazine in 1976, "Would you believe it? Superstition lives," before diving into the ways in which black Americans were seeking solutions to the hardships of the 1970s in the occult. There were temples that mixed mysticism with metaphysics, leftovers from the 30s and 40s in urban areas. Approximately 200 to 250 people joined a village in South Carolina, practicing the Yoruba religion and rituals that the conservative magazine called primitive religion and witchcraft rule. Ebony also estimated that out of hundreds of astrologers in Chicago, approximately 70 were black. One woman named Queen Willa Dixon received 20 to 30 clients a day, which she reported allowed her to buy a home and make her house calls in a leather impaneled Cadillac. By the 1990s, belief in most types of the conjuring from the enslavement era in the black American community was associated with bumpkin ignorance or mental illness, and voodoo associated with immigrants. But millions of black Americans believed in astrology, dialed up the fraudulent Miss Cleo on the Psychic Friends Network, which was regularly hosted by Dionne Warwick, and some dabbled in occultism alongside their Christian beliefs. And as for the extremely religious, magic was definitely real as the devil. So real that witchcraft in media was was considered demonic and subversive, barring hella black children from any depictions of witchcraft in media. So the belief in magic lingered, and it coexisted with Christian religion and expectations for black people to be modern and westernized Christians, capable of fitting into a white society. Thankfully, my grandparents and mom weren't anti-witchcraft, but I wasn't allowed to watch the hood classics. And the depictions of black witches and the supernatural in media that I saw were The Wiz, Twitches, Angelina Johnson in Harry Potter, and Raven Baxter in That's So Raven. I never saw it, but Whoopi Goldberg played a medium in Ghost, and the most serious and culturally significant early depictions of Gullah Geechee, Yoruba, and Louisiana Hoodoo was 1991's Daughters of the Dust and 1997's Eve's Bayou. If you've never seen Eve's Bayou, this is your sign to go see it now. Depictions of magical black women were rare, and when included, they were often stereotypically Caribbean, had no personal motivations, or lacked backstories like Rochelle in The Craft. However, the addition of characters like in season 3 of American Horror Story, which fictionalized Marie Laveau, played by Angela Bassett, was really cool. And one of my favorite shows of all time, True Blood, there was the shady Miss Jeanette, played by Aisha Hines, and the discovery of Hoodoo by Lafayette Reynolds, played by the late and great Nelson Ellis. More recently, Hoodoo was practiced by the character Diamond in P-Valley, which was a twist I didn't see coming. On The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, the character Prudence, played by Tati Gabrielle, is one of the practitioners of the European-style demonic witchcraft. That's really all I could think of, even though I bet I'm probably missing a few, and I know y'all gonna tell me. If you have a favorite depiction of black conjure workers, witches, or clairvoyants in media, let me know in the comments. In recent years, black women and femmes have cultivated online communities on conjuration and root work to exchange information and practices and apply their magical skills, from offering readings of celebrities and political events on YouTube to branching into outside traditions like tarot readings. I've got interesting reads gathered for you in the source list on Patreon, and I'll be honest, part of this video was inspired by a tweet I saw where it was somewhere along the lines of, you paid a random from Fiverr to do root work on you and you wonder why your life is in shambles. And that made me laugh, and I just had to do a little digging. It was interesting seeing how during enslavement and beyond, magic was used to explain the world as it was for black people. A world where we have been divided against each other, dehumanized, and exploited. This video was also inspired by the never-ending sentiment I've seen and even espoused myself that somebody somewhere is sending negative energy, rooting on someone's downfall, blocking somebody's blessings, putting a root on them, etc. So the most striking part of this research was the recurring theme of paranoia about evildoers in the black community, and rumors that those who were succeeding while others were failing were dabbling in magic. History really is so cyclical. By a similar token, in modern Africa, who has its own complicated history with colonialism and witchcraft, in the past decade alone, approximately 20,000 people, mostly children, women, the elderly, and people with albinism, have been harmed or murdered because they were believed to be witches. It's most common in places with a significant lack of resources, where citizens are more likely to seek someone to blame for their chronic and systemic misfortune wrought by white supremacy. Here in the States, like during enslavement, the misfortune of the Great Depression, and scratching for survival in 1970s America, black conjuring and interest in the occult has once again risen in prominence because it can be a limitless source of hope, and because more black people than ever before have left the church. It's no wonder that internet gurus with toxic or ill-informed views who happen to tweet positive messages and offer readings or conjuring classes can make big money. Modern obsessions with manifesting, a descendant of the 19th century law of attraction, and a personal habit which I'll never give up because it's free and serotonin boosting and life is hard, honey, may one day be included in a future black historian's essay on black magic culture in the 2020s. That's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed this